You know the US Constitution, right? Well, think of it as this world-famous novel that everybody's read. What we're going to look at today is its first draft, a version that's so different it's almost unrecognizable, and it shows us a totally different path American history could have taken. So what if the America we know today just wasn't the original plan at all? It's a wild thought, right? But for more than 10 years, this country was, believe it or not, running on a completely different operating system. Okay, let's get into it.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of us kind of just forget that there's this big gap. I mean, a whole decade between the Declaration of Independence and when the Constitution actually kicked in. And in that time, well, America was governed by something else entirely. It was called the Articles of Confederation.
So let's jump into America's forgotten first draft. And we're not going to treat this thing like some historical footnote, okay? This was the real deal, the foundational blueprint for the brand new nation. So what exactly were the Articles of Confederation? Well, sometimes they're called the country's first constitution. And that label, that's a big deal. We're not talking about just a memo or some kind of treaty here. Calling it a constitution, that gives it real weight, real legitimacy. For a time, this was the supreme law of the land. And get this is the moment the brand name is born. The Articles are what formally took those 13 separate colonies and joined them together for the very first time under one single name, the United States of America. It's kind of funny, right? They knew what they wanted to call themselves, even if they hadn't quite figured out what that word united was really going to mean. So here's the best way to think about it. This wasn't a merger, right? Not like a marriage where everything gets thrown into one pot. It was much more like a contract between neighbors. You know, we agree on these very specific rules, but you stay on your side of the fence and I'll stay on mine. All right, so let's get into the blueprint itself. How was this thing actually designed? Well, the whole architecture was built around one single driving idea: state power. All the power was supposed to stay with the states. And believe me, that wasn't an accident. It was totally by design. There's this great way to put it. The independence is the feature, it's not a bug. And that just nails the mindset of the time. I mean, think about it. They had just fought this long, brutal war to get rid of a powerful king. The last thing they wanted was another strong central government bossing them around. So a weak federal government, that wasn't a mistake. It was the whole point. State independence was the feature. Yeah, the document basically just sketched out the relationship between the states and the U.S. as a whole. And I love that word, sketched. It's not carved in stone, you know? It's a light touch. It was all about the 13 individual states being the strong pillars, and the United States was just this thin roof resting on top. So the architecture really prioritized state sovereignty over any kind of federal unity. The real power, the center of gravity, wasn't in some big national capital. Nope. It was in the 13 individual state capitals. The states were basically running their own shows, almost like they were separate little countries. Here's a great analogy for it. It was like a house with 13 private rooms and just one shared front door. Each state was its own room, with its own laws, its own way of doing things. They were totally separate inside. The only thing they shared was that front door to the rest of the world. Okay, but let's talk about the limits of that unity. Because if the states were completely independent, you just have 13 little countries, right? So what was that shared front door all about? Well, there had to be some exceptions to all this independence. Two, to be exact. So exception number one was all about war and national defense. This was critical. When it came to an outside threat, the 13 states agreed they had to act as one. You know, if some hostile navies showed up off the coast, they weren't going to see Virginia or Massachusetts, they were going to see the United States. It was basically a defensive pact. And the second and only other exception, diplomacy and foreign affairs. When it came time to deal with the big European empires, the states surrendered their independence and spoke with one voice. It makes sense, right? War and diplomacy are really two sides of the same coin: survival. So when you boil it all down, you get this really radical idea. The United States essentially only existed when it was facing outward. To the rest of the world, it was one country. But internally, to itself, it was basically 13 separate states. And that was the whole system, a loose confederation that was really defined by its limits. It was held together by just two things: war and diplomacy. That's it. Everything else was left up to the individual states. Okay, so now we get to the part where we rewrite the nation. Because as we all know, this first draft, well, it didn't stick. the whole system turned out to be pretty shaky. So by 1789, it was clear that it was time for a major rewrite. And the shift was huge. Before 1789, the whole system prioritized state independence. Then, the U.S. Constitution goes into effect. And after 1789, the new Constitution basically flips that entire relationship on its head. This wasn't a software update, folks. This was a whole new operating system.
So let's look at these two blueprints for a nation side by side. Under the Articles of Confederation, you had a loose league of independent states, with union as kind of an afterthought. State sovereignty was the core principle. But with the Constitution, you get a strong federal union made up of states. And now, national unity is the core principle. It's not an evolution, it's a complete 180.
And that's really the main takeaway here. You just can't understand the final draft without reading the first one. The Constitution we have today was a direct response to the problems of the Articles. It was built specifically to create a stronger national government. So to really get why it's designed the way it is, you have to know what it was replacing. And that leaves us with this one last kind of provocative thought. Unity wasn't the default. It was the upgrade. The original blueprint for America wasn't about unity at all. It was about independence. The united country we think of today, that wasn't the starting point. It was an engineered solution, an upgrade, that completely rewrote the nation's architecture.